the dawn of the video game era, there was one name that reigned above all others, and was the first company to become synonymous with gaming: Atari. On the back of the video game boom of the early 1980s, Atari became the fastest growing company in American history. But, much like the story of Icarus, not that Icarus, they also plummeted back down to earth like no other company in gaming has. No, not even Sega. As the video game industry collapsed from a market cap of over $2 billion in 1982 down to $100 million in 1985, Atari faced a similar collapse in its balance sheets, and its parent company, Warner Communications, decided to fix this by breaking the company up and selling it off. The half of the company that designed and produced home consoles and home computers was branded as Atari Corporation and was sold to the founder and former head of Commodore, Jack Tramiel, while the other half of the company that designed and produced arcade games became Atari Games and was spun off into a quasi-independent company in conjunction with Namco, which Atari had a long history with, and actually took the majority controlling share in this new company. Since Atari's arcade business was actually still profitable, it largely continued on its way, doing its thing under the co-ownership of its original parent company and Namco. The next year, in 1985, as Nintendo set to work on its quest to rebuild the smoldering wreck of the console market, Atari Games released a little arcade game called Gauntlet to arcades around the country. The game was a standout for allowing 4 players on one machine, not just in simple competitive games like Pong, but in a thorough dungeon-crawling adventure game. A few years later, after Nintendo had thoroughly established itself as the master and gatekeeper of the console market, Atari Games, through its newfound subsidiary Tengen, tried to bring Gauntlet to the NES, and found themselves butting up against Nintendo, as the company at first sought to try and force their cartridges onto the market by reverse engineering the NES security lockout chip and shipping their own bootleg cartridges. However, retailer reluctance to carry these unauthorized games and legal threats from Nintendo caused the company to get in line and become a proper licensee. Thus, these games have a nebulous recorded release date, appearing first in 1987 under Tengen's unique trade dress for its cartridges, then again in 1988, now in the standard Nintendo form with that well-known seal of quality insured. The first arcade game would be followed by a sequel, which in turn would get another NES port in 1991. From there, the series would take some detours. First, there was a Gauntlet 3, which would be made exclusively for the Amiga and Atari ST home computers, the Atari ST being a product of Atari Games' separated-at-birth sister company, Atari Corporation. Then, a remake of the original game for the Sega Genesis would morph into Gauntlet 4, courtesy of Tengen. However, by the mid-1990s, the already confused and divided lineage of the original Atari virtually came to an end. Poetically, both companies born out of the 1984 split-up and fire sale of Atari Inc. would meet their final fate together in April of 1996. Atari Corporation had shriveled up and died on the console market, with its last desperate throw of the dice, the Atari Jaguar, being utterly crushed like a bug by the PlayStation and the Saturn. That company was then sold off to a hard drive manufacturer called JTS Manufacturing, in a pretty basic form of financial arbitrage used to acquire the patents and other intellectual property assets the venerable name Atari still held. Meanwhile, the arcade company Atari Games finally came to the very end of its time with its original owner, as Warner Communications was now Time Warner, and it decided in April of 1996 to close its gaming division, Time Warner Interactive, under which Atari Games had operated. This led to the arcade company being sold to the one last American entity that might be interested in acquiring such a thing, a company called WMS Industries, that by this time owned Bally, Midway, and Williams, 3 of the biggest names left standing from the American side of the arcade industry. With the potential valuable properties from Atari games now under its roof, Midway Games set out to revive one of them, and in 1998 it introduced Gauntlet Legends to North American arcades. This was a fully updated resurrection of the franchise for the 3D era, with 4-player hack-and-slash action, large explorable levels, and Dungeons & Dragons-esque settings. And it was a hit, as big as a hit could be in the waning days of the arcade market in the West. Like we said in an earlier episode, Crazy Taxi, which came out a year later in 1999, still claims the dubious crown of being the last great arcade hit, but Gauntlet Legends is right behind it in terms of late arcade-era popularity and name recognition. Smartly, and perhaps obviously, Midway decided it needed to bring this relative hit to home consoles, with it getting a Nintendo 64 port in September of 1999, with all 4 players intact, provided you had the expansion pack, followed by a skimped-down PlayStation port in March of 2000, and a high-quality Dreamcast upgrade in June. However, by this time, the ownership position of the Atari name had once again taken a turn. The hard drive company JTS that bought the home console and computer version of Atari sold its namesake and intellectual property to Hasbro, as that company was angling to get into the video game market through the then open back door of the late 1990s for reboots and reimaginings of late 70s and early 80s arcade games, many of which Atari held the rights to. However, going back to the original split-up of the home and arcade Atari divisions, one had always maintained the exclusive right to use the Atari name on home products like computers and game consoles, while the other retained exclusive use of the name in arcade market settings. So when Gauntlet Legends came home to consoles, it was free of the Atari name, and in fact, Midway went a step further and totally dissolved the Atari game's identity in late 1999, making Gauntlet Legends the last game to have any connection to Atari games, marking the end of yet another era in gaming, which would be followed up just 2 years later by Midway deciding to exit the arcade market altogether in 2001, saying that the market was, for all intents and purposes, dead. But if you read carefully, you'll notice the game we're here to cover isn't Gauntlet Legends, it's Gauntlet Dark Legacy. So what's that then? Well, it's an expansion pack, an upgrade, a version 1.5 of Gauntlet Legends, too similar to be considered a complete sequel, but too reshaped and different to be considered the same game or a port. It's little remembered, but occasionally, back in the days when arcade games were still successful, publishers would attempt to extend their shelf life with gamers by shipping out updated versions of the game ROM to arcades to either swap out or usually just upgrade from the original ROM. Street Fighter fans are likely intimately familiar with this. Sometimes these versions were inconsequential and unnoticeable bug fixes, but sometimes they were major changes, additions, or expansions to the base game. This is the case for Gauntlet Dark Legacy, as it added new levels, new characters, more complex combat, and new cooperative gameplay elements. This updated version started trickling into arcades sometime across 1999 and into 2000. While the Dreamcast version of Gauntlet Legends retained the original name, it was for all intents and purposes a melded-together port of the original, with most of Dark Legacy's enhancements and content added in. It just didn't say any of this in its name. Being on a next-generation system, it was also a step up in terms of resolution, frame rate, and texture quality over the N64 and PlayStation versions. But even that just made more apparent that the technically impressive elements of Gauntlet wasn't its base graphics, but in its pushing many characters on the screen at once. That is to say, it's not a graphically impressive game on its face. Little of that changed when the game came to the PS2 in late 2001. This time, fully ported and named Gauntlet Dark Legacy. The game would arrive on the Xbox and GameCube in early 2002, with the GameCube version arriving at retail on March 6th. Much like the arcade game that evolved and changed with each iteration, the home console versions also changed and had minor and major tweaks and additions from the Dreamcast to the PS2 to the Xbox and GameCube. So taking the GameCube version here, we get a boot-up sequence with a noticeably compressed full-motion video trying, rather confusingly, to tell some kind of story. with a faceless wizard summoning a mega demon who promptly kills him, and then another faceless wizard comes along and casts some kind of magic that either kills or takes control over some goblins. But at least it transitions pretty smoothly from that FMV into the title screen, where we get another very simple choice of getting the game started or hitting up the options. The options gives us many standard choices, such as music volume and stereo sound, difficulty settings and friendly fire and multiplayer, control settings, rumble on and off, and some aiming settings. Strangely, there's a setting listed here for compass, which is just to turn the compass on or off on screen during the game. You would think that could just go into one of the other menus here, but starting things up, you're dropped off at the arcade-style 4-way player entry screen, where anywhere from 1 to 4 players can jump into the game and choose from a lineup of different character types, each of which have different stats and slightly different qualities. But in order to conform to the gameplay, they do all have the same ability for ranged and close attacks, so there aren't super dramatic differences even if you're a jester versus a mage versus a warrior. Mostly just different specialties in what each character type is good at. While Gauntlet is in many ways its own genre-defining game type, to make the closest analogy as to what Gauntlet Dark Legacy is like is probably to compare it to the 3D beat-em-up or hack-and-slash genres. The player, or players, explore a 3D adventure map, vanquishing the waves of enemies that spawn from many differently themed generator points, be it cave entrances they emerge from, rotten food they spawn from, or fractured graves that they rise from. But unlike a beat-em-up, you don't really go to town on an individual enemy, but instead go for quantity over quality in terms of fighting monsters, as it only takes a single strike to kill most of them, and the challenge comes from wading through piles of enemies to reach their spawn points and put an end to their spontaneous generation. Of course, some enemies are bigger and more imposing opponents that do require repeated attacks or magic to dispatch, but they're much fewer and farther between, and treated sort of like mini-boss encounters throughout the levels. The maps in the 3D Gauntlet games are sprawling, yet not so much like an open world. They're still linear and move left to right or forward and backwards up and down the screen, with progression from one area to the next, but it's not just a straight path. There are branching paths, dead ends to explore, and areas that loop back around, with optional doors that can be opened if you secure keys throughout the map to get through them. That introduces that there are also items, magic, and money to collect and manage. Since your health will inevitably decline as you come in constant contact with monsters, there are a plethora of food items that will add back to it to keep you in the game. There are also different collectible magic spells that can be taken in, hoarded, and used at an opportune time to clear a den of enemies, dispatch a mini-boss character, or be used to fend off the Grim Reaper should you accidentally run into him and find him leeching your life away. There are the aforementioned keys, which you can use as you see fit to either open locked doors on the map, or locked treasure chests to get more loot. Plus, there's gold, which you can accumulate and use to purchase more items and upgrades after the level's over. Lastly, there is the thing you go into these levels to find, the rune stones that are needed to consider the level complete. Collecting the stones for each of the levels in each world is what unlocks the boss battle that accompanies each world as well. And that is the gameplay loop to Gauntlet Dark Legacy, and kind of by extension the gameplay loop for Gauntlet in general. The thing to mention here is that the levels themselves are actually quite long to play through. Just the first level that I captured playing with a friend took nearly 20 minutes to complete. We were making sure to cover every corner and collect everything we could find, so I'm sure you could speed through this much quicker. But the point is that these are not quick, breezy platformer-style levels you complete in just a couple of minutes, but real dedicated adventures you need to sit down and work through, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from an arcade game. But the longer you go on, the more likely you are to need defeated quarters, so from that angle it makes sense. Now the sound and music, like the graphics, are serviceable representations of what the game needs to be without being anything flashy or noticeable. Those gripes and lack of polish aside, Gauntlet Dark Legends is still a mindlessly fun arcade ROM. It can even be separated from its arcade origins to an extent, since it's not a short burst kind of game. It can be played as a lengthy single-player or multiplayer adventure game with real progression towards an ultimate endpoint. Both single-player and multiplayer are equally valid ways to play, but it's certainly a game to keep in mind for any multiplayer game nights, especially since it's a good 4-player game, and not even one that needs to split the screen 4 ways. However, getting one's hands on this game may be a different story. While the PlayStation 2 version, as usual, takes the sales crown with 1,150,000 units sold, the GameCube notches a meager sales victory over the Xbox version, having sold just 180,000 units compared to the Xbox's 170,000 units, according to VG charts. It should of course be remembered that the GameCube and Xbox have 4 controller ports for 4-player mode built right in, while the PlayStation 2 required a multi-tap adapter to add in players 3 and 4. So if you're really planning on a 4-way multiplayer session, you might want to lean on the latter 2 versions. I swear, when I started ChronCube, I had absolutely no idea that we'd end up creating an impromptu funeral wake for the last gasp of arcade gaming. And yet, here we are. That's the interesting thing about reapproaching history in this context. Going from Crazy Taxi and Super Monkey Ball to Smashing Drive and 18-Wheeler, and now here we are with Gauntlet Dark Legacy. It makes sense that the last bunch of successful arcade games were getting last-chance console ports right at the end of their relevance. What's even more interesting, though, is that this is the very last gasp not just of arcades, but the company that spawned them, Atari. While the name Atari has continued to be utilized by whichever company has paid for the rights to it as a piece of intellectual property, the actual original organization, founded in 1972, was broken into 2 parts in 1984. The console and computer maker was liquidated for parts in 1996, while the arcade company lasted just a bit longer by being sold off and subsumed by Midway, finally being shut down and phased out in the early 2000s, with this series here being its last contribution to the world of gaming. So while this will not be the last we see the name Atari, it will be the last time we get something descended directly from that original pioneering company.